Hey everybody, it's Pastor Stephen here, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of Ask Anything, where you submit your questions about the Bible, theology, or the Christian life, and in each video episode, I answer one of those questions. And today we've got a question about an Old Testament passage. It's a great question about a puzzling passage, and the question goes like this. In 1 Samuel 28, a medium calls up the ghost of Samuel, and Samuel appears from out of the ground. Where was he, and how did Samuel know what was going on earth? It's a weird story. Well, I agree with the person who submitted this question. It is a weird story. It's a very puzzling passage that people have asked questions about over the centuries, and there are probably some questions we might have about this passage that we can't answer with complete certainty. But that doesn't mean that we can't answer some of the questions that we might have. And so I want to begin by just simply summarizing the story for those who might not be familiar with it. The story comes in the book of 1 Samuel, and at this point in the book of 1 Samuel, God has rejected King Saul as his king. Back in chapter 13, Saul had offered an unlawful sacrifice, a sacrifice that was not according to God's ordinances and his commands. And at that point, God told Saul that he would no longer continue his kingdom, but that he was going to choose a man after his own heart to be king. And then in chapter 15, we see the final rejection of Saul, when Saul yet again rebels against the Lord by refusing to obey the Lord's commands. He fails to destroy the Amalekites as the Lord commanded. And at that point, the prophet Samuel confronts Saul and tells him that God has rejected him as king. Now, throughout the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, what we see is that Saul continues to move further and further away from God and continues to rebel against God. And at the same time, David begins to rise in favor with God and rise in power. At the same time that Saul is declining and decreasing in favor with God and in power, David is rising and increasing in favor and in power. And Saul and David are at odds with one another for most of the book. In fact, Saul even tries to kill David several times without success. So we see this progression where Saul is moving further and further away from God. And then we get to chapter 28. And at the beginning of chapter 28, the setting here is that Saul is facing an impending invasion from the Philistines, and he is in big trouble. He's got a problematic situation on his hands. And at this point, the prophet Samuel has already died. And Samuel would have been the primary person Saul would have consulted in a troubling situation like this. But since Samuel has died, Saul cannot consult him. And so Saul is terrified and isn't sure what to do. Saul seeks a word from the Lord and seeks guidance from the Lord. But the Lord refuses to answer Saul because Saul had rebelled so much against him to this point. And so in his desperation, Saul decides to seek advice from a medium, or what we might call a witch. And this is what it says in 1 Samuel 28, verse 7. It says, "Then Saul said to his servants, 'Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servants said to him, 'Behold, there is a medium at Endor.'" Now, it's worth noting here that this is really a new low point in Saul's rebellion and sin against God. He's already sinned against the Lord in many different ways, but this point sort of marks the rock bottom in terms of Saul's rebellion against the Lord. Because we know that the Old Testament law strictly prohibited the use of mediums or engaging in necromancy, which was consulting with the dead. That was strictly forbidden according to Old Testament law. For example, we could read in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10, where it says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination, or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. You see, Saul knew that this practice was forbidden. And not only that, but in verse 3 of chapter 28, it tells us that he had previously outlawed mediums and necromancers in Israel. So in this moment, in chapter 28, not only is he knowingly rebelling against the Lord's commands, but he's engaging in the ultimate act of hypocrisy by doing things that he himself had forbidden in Israel. But nevertheless, Saul, in his desperation, wants guidance, and he decides to consult this witch, this medium. And he tells this woman that he wants her to bring up a dead person so that he can consult with him. So she asks, "Who would you like me to bring up?" And Saul says that he would like to talk with Samuel. And then what happens next is kind of interesting, because what happens is this woman sees this figure coming up from the earth. And at first, she doesn't know who this figure is, and she's actually quite frightened. But she describes the figure to Saul, and Saul immediately recognizes that this is Samuel himself who is appearing. And here is what Samuel then says to Saul. He says, "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, this is an incredibly bizarre story. And it brings up several questions that we might ask in response. Number one, we could simply ask, what is happening here exactly? Was this witch or this medium actually able to consult with the dead and bring someone up to speak with from the dead? If so, that would be a very strange thing, because we don't find anything else in the Bible that has a parallel like that. So what is happening here exactly? That's one question. A second question we could ask is this really Samuel? Is Samuel actually speaking from beyond the grave? Or is this something or someone else masquerading as Samuel? We don't really have any other stories in the Old Testament where someone speaks to the living from the grave. And so that's a very odd thing and brings up questions as well. And then thirdly, we could ask that if this is indeed Samuel, where was he coming from exactly? It describes him as coming up from the earth, but what does that mean, and how should we understand that? So we have several questions here, and let's take each one at a time. First of all, the simple question, what exactly is happening here? Many people are disturbed by this story because the Old Testament forbids mediums or the practice of necromancy, consulting with the dead. And yet here it seems to be a situation where the king of Israel is engaging in necromancy and is actually successful at it, where he is actually able to communicate with the dead. So what are we to make of that? Well, we need to say a couple of things regarding necromancy or consulting with the dead. Number one, we need to see that the Old Testament does not forbid necromancy because it says that it is impossible. It forbids necromancy because it says that it's an abomination to the Lord and it's incredibly wicked. As we already observed, Deuteronomy calls these practices abominations, and God's people are forbidden from communicating with the dead or trying to communicate with the dead, not because there's no such thing as the supernatural or no such thing as communication with the dead, but because this practice is wicked and it is an abomination to God. I don't think it's going too far to say that these kinds of practices from a biblical perspective are satanic. So we need to first say that. Secondly, when we read this account, I believe that if you read the account carefully, it was not the witch's power, this medium's power, that allowed Saul to consult with the dead. But I believe in this unique circumstance, it was actually God's power that allowed this to happen. Now, I say that for several reasons. I say that, first of all, because When you read the story, the witch seems surprised when Samuel appears, which suggests that she wasn't actually expecting this to work or to be able to happen in this particular circumstance. Secondly, when Samuel does appear, this figure does appear, the witch doesn't know who the figure is, which suggests that she didn't really have a full awareness of what was going on or complete control over what was happening. So these details are signs of someone who does not necessarily have full command over the dead. And I believe if God had not allowed this particular moment to happen, this conversation to happen by his power, it would never have happened. But it does appear that on this occasion, Saul is able to speak with someone who has come from beyond the grave. Now, that brings us to the next question, which is, was this really Samuel? There have been some who have suggested that this was not actually Samuel, but was a demon that was masquerading as Samuel. Personally, I don't find that convincing, and most biblical commentators don't find that convincing because if you read the story, there are several things that would suggest that this is in fact Samuel. First of all, the figure had the appearance of Samuel, and when he was described to Saul, Saul immediately recognized him as Samuel. Secondly, this figure repeats many of the same exact prophecies that Samuel prophesied during his life. And then thirdly, we see that this figure gives another additional true prophecy about what was yet to come, namely Saul and his sons and the way that they would die. So the most straightforward reading of the text is that this is, in fact, Samuel appearing and speaking from beyond the grave. Now, that strikes many of us as extremely strange because we don't really have any other examples in Scripture of someone who has died coming back to speak to the living. But in response to that, we should say a couple of things. First of all, just because something is unusual, that doesn't mean it is impossible. I think we would all agree that God bringing back someone who has died to speak to the living is extremely unusual. In fact, there may not be any other parallel really in the Bible like this. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean God is unable to use this method to speak to someone in this unique way. We should also note that even though this is extremely unusual, it's not completely without parallel in the Scriptures. There is at least one other example in the New Testament where those saints who have gone on beyond the grave, who have died, do appear to the living. And the example I'm thinking of is the example of the Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on the mountain and he's transfigured before them. And in that moment, Moses and Elijah also appear to them. And we know that Moses and Elijah had been long dead at that point. And so there's another instance where those saints who have died do actually appear to the living. Now the question becomes, obviously this is a very unusual kind of thing. Why would God bring back Samuel in this particular occasion for this moment to speak to Saul? Well, we can't say with certainty exactly why God chose to do this in this moment. But perhaps God wanted to use Samuel one last time as a prophet in Saul's life. We know that Samuel was the primary prophet in Saul's life who spoke to him and who spoke words of judgment and confrontation to Saul. And perhaps God wanted to use Samuel one last time to pronounce judgment upon Saul, and not only to pronounce judgment, but also to prophesy about how he was going to die very, very soon. Now, the last question that many people ask about this passage is, where was Samuel coming from? The passage describes him as coming up from below, coming up from the earth. And many people say, well, what does that mean? Where exactly was he coming from in this moment? This is one of those cases where we won't be able to have all of our questions answered, but I think we need to remember a few things when we're trying to think through this particular question. First of all, we need to recognize that in the Old Testament, very little is said about what life after death looks like. The New Testament elaborates much more in detail about what life after death looks like, and about heaven and hell, and about judgment and paradise. The Old Testament says very little about those subjects. In fact, the Old Testament speaks mainly in general terms about those who have died going to the realm of the dead. In fact, in the Old Testament, one of the most common words that is used to refer to those who have died is that they have gone to Sheol. And the word Sheol is a very generic word. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, it's a very generic word that simply refers to the realm of the dead or the place of the dead. In many cases, it's simply synonymous with the grave. After you die, you go down to the grave. And saying that someone went down to Sheol is speaking in generic terms like that. It is, in many cases, synonymous with the grave or death itself. Beyond that, the Old Testament doesn't speak in great detail about the state of the afterlife. Now, here's why this is important. When this text describes Samuel coming up from the earth, it is telling us very simply and very generally that his spirit came back from the dead or back from the grave to speak to Saul. And that, I think, is about all it's telling us. Really nothing more and nothing less. It's not commenting on the place where he was or the state where he was. It's simply saying he came back from the dead, so to speak, back from the land of the dead to speak to the land of the living. And we need to remember that because we should be careful that we don't jump to conclusions when we're reading this text that really go beyond where the text would take us. For example, some have looked at this description in this text of Samuel coming up from the earth, and they've concluded that, well, perhaps since he was coming up from below, that he was coming up from a place of judgment. But the text never says that. The text is merely describing the dead in ways that were consistent with other ways that the Old Testament described the dead, is that when you die, you go down to the grave, you go down to Sheol, the realm of the dead. And Samuel was coming back from that place to speak to the living. But we can't press it farther than that and go farther than that. Another example here is that some people have read Samuel's words in verse 19, where he says, "Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me." And he says that to Saul. And some people have pressed that detail and have concluded that perhaps that means Saul and his sons will be in the same place in eternity, their final place in eternity, where Samuel himself is. But again, I think that's pressing the text beyond where it would take us, because when Samuel says, "Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me," he's simply speaking in generic terms and is saying, tomorrow you and your sons will also be in the grave, just like I have gone to the grave. I don't believe he's commenting there on the state of their eternal souls. So in summary, we have to be careful that we don't press this text beyond where it would take us. It simply describes Samuel as coming back from the realm of the dead to speak to the living and to deliver this word of judgment to Saul on this very unique occasion. So let me just, in closing, give you some final thoughts about this passage. I think that one of the things that we should come away with as we read this text is that we should be reminded of the wickedness of necromancy or consulting the dead. You know, these practices are things that some people still engage in today. And I suppose one might read this text and say, well, if King Saul dabbled in it and it worked, then perhaps it's okay for other people today to dabble in it and to try it. Well, that would be the most wrong conclusion that one could draw from this passage, because we need to remember that this story is really meant to illustrate for us how wicked King Saul had become and how far he had strayed away from God. The act of necromancy was something that was forbidden, and the fact that he engaged in it was an illustration of his own sinfulness. The reason that necromancy was forbidden, the reason that consulting mediums was forbidden and that it was considered so wicked was because it was an act of someone trying to seek guidance outside of the Lord. Someone trying to seek guidance that the Lord had not provided, and instead of going to God and to His Word and to His revelation, seeking some other kind of knowledge. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19, it says, "When they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living?" You see, the point here is that we should seek wisdom from God and guidance from God and His Word, and not from other sources that are not God Himself and that are forbidden. In fact, when King Saul's death is recorded and recounted in the book of 1 Chronicles, this is precisely one of the reasons why he is condemned. It says in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, "So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse." One of the simple takeaways we could have from this passage is, do not seek wisdom from fortune tellers, from witches, or from mediums, or from necromancers. Those are forbidden sources. And those things, according to Scripture, are considered to be abominations. But rather, we should seek our wisdom and our guidance from the Lord and from His Word. And if there is something that the Lord has not revealed to us, then it is not some kind of information or some kind of wisdom that we should be seeking. I hope that this has been helpful to you in understanding a very strange Old Testament passage, and I encourage you to continue sending me your questions. You can submit your questions to askanything@highviewepc.org, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.